Hello, welcome to our Q&A about our 2024 Global Internet Phenomena Report. I'm Susanna Schwartz, Head of Analyst and Media Relations for Sandvine. I'm talking today to Chief Technology Officer Alexander Havang and to Bill Basquin, our VP of Sales. So we are going to go over some of the highlights of our report this year. So I'm going to start right off the bat by asking, we've been doing the report for many years, but this one is definitely a first of its kind. So maybe, Alexander, you could start off by just telling us what's different about this year's methodology and visualizations that makes this a different report and a more useful report than in the years past. Can you give us a little synopsis of what's a little bit different?
Sure. It's actually quite a bit. First of all, this is the first report, and I think we've been doing them since 2017. So it's a nice tradition for Sandvine and the telco industry. But this is the first time that the data is based on Sandvine's AppLogic engine. So every prior release has been based on legacy technology like DRDL. And AppLogic just gives you or gives us a better accuracy. 95% plus maybe 98% on application classification is kind of what we expect from this customer base and from this product in terms of accuracy. And the other thing that it does is that with AppLogic, we have something called content categories. So instead of just being able to say this is Netflix, we can now go one step further and say, is it Netflix gaming? Is it Netflix download? Is it Netflix streaming video? So inside the app, the activity that the subscriber is doing is something we call content classification. And that is now in the report for the first time. We also have, which I think is the coolest part, is popularity numbers. So we can tell not just percentages in volume up and volume down by app, but also how many subscribers or what percentage of the subscriber base are doing the particular apps that we're looking at. And I just, in terms of trending and things like that, I think popularity is pretty interesting to look at and it gives you a lot of clues on how people are using the internet and what is popular in different regions.
Yes, and in the report, we break out the top 5 brands per category, like video, social media, device gaming, television. We break out the app popularity for fixed and mobile in the report this year by percentage of users and user volume. Bill, is there anything you would like to add in terms of what you are initially finding to be very interesting about our data this year?
Yeah, and just to highlight a couple points that Alexander made, the content classification I think is really cool this year because it allows us to kind of cut across all the application categories and look at what are subscribers really doing with this internet service. And what I saw, particularly I saw it really pop out in Americas, was that video was even a higher percentage than I thought it was. Because it was masked in application categories of social media. And sure, it shows up in on-demand streaming and different, obviously video categories. But the prevalence of video when you look at the content type is actually even higher. But I also see regional fluctuations in that. So I think America's was the top, and it kind of went down from there across the other theaters. So I thought that was really cool because it allows us to look across the application categories. I also really like the popularity counter. I think it's really interesting to see what people are doing, and just which are the top apps, what are the top sort of categories, and which is also sometimes masked, but when we're looking at just sheer volume. So of course, video is the highest volume, but it's really interesting to see like what are the apps and the services that a lot of people are using that are as popular as video, they just don't consume as much volume of traffic. So it's a nice way of looking at the traffic to see these trends evolve year over year.
Right. And just to be clear, we are breaking out the traffic by app volume per subscriber, app user volume, and by app popularity, as you just described. Maybe, Alexander, could you explain to us what the app volume per subscriber is compared to the app user volume, and why that's important for establishing a benchmark against which, maybe we can benchmark and, trend, do the trending that we couldn't do before. Could you tell us the difference between those two, the app volume per user and the app user volume?
Yes, they are slightly confusing terms, but the math is pretty simple. You'd simply take the total amount of, let's say, streaming video in a network, and you divide by the total number of subscribers. That's the simplest math, and that gives you app user volume. And then the flip side of that is look at the volume that the users of a particular app are doing with that app. That's what we call subscriber volume.
Okay.
So how you use those two metrics is, let's say you add one more subscriber, an average new subscriber to a network. Now, you don't know what that subscriber is going to do, but on average, for instance, in a fixed network, he's going to do 14.5 gigabytes of volume in a day, because that's the average that we see across all the fixed operators.
Mm-hmm.
And 5.7 gigabytes of that is likely to be video if he behaves like any other subscriber, like the average subscriber in that network.
Mm-hmm.
But there is no such thing as an average subscriber. You're either me, or you're Susanna, or you're someone else, right? And if you happen to be, let's say, a cloud gamer or someone who's playing PlayStation, it's interesting to see how much volume does that particular person, like a gamer, let's say a PlayStation gamer, how much volume does he bring to the network? Well, it just happens to be much more than the 14.5, because the PlayStation gamers add 13 gigabytes of downstream traffic just on gaming, plus the video, plus everything else they're doing. So it depends on how are you going to use the data. Is it just for planning, or are you architecting the network for use of a particular application?
Right. And we saw that when we break this out this way, we started to see more distinctions between the fixed and mobile networks. In fact, we have a section in the report called Fixed and Mobile Worlds Apart, because in parsing the data out this way, there were some really clear differences between how people are using their fixed networks versus their mobile networks. Do either one of you want to comment on, were there any surprises in that regard, in terms of how people are using, mobile versus fixed networks?
Yes, Susanna. So it was really interesting looking at fixed versus mobile. And generally speaking, when we look at speeds and fixed versus mobile, or we look at volume and usage, we always have this like 10x rule. And the 10x rule is that if a user is doing something on mobile, there's going to be 10 times that on the fixed side in terms of volume, and potentially in terms of average speeds. And that's partly due to the differences in the technology. This report really stayed very consistent with that, where a lot of the categories, if I'm looking at the application categories, they're roughly in that sort of like 10x. So if there was 500 megabytes of subscriber volume of video on mobile, it was 5 gigabytes on the fixed side. And there's lots of reasons for that, because fixed often has multiple users in the household, higher bit rate. But then there's places where that's not true, where the volume on certain apps and mobile was maybe only 5 times higher in the fixed network. And we see that with social media. And so there's some really apps that kind of come out, categories that pop out as being really just so much more dominant in mobile than in fixed. But generally speaking, as kind of just a general comment, I still see a lot of that sort of 10x comparison between mobile and fixed. Really, and also the other one that popped out for me was communication, which makes sense. On a mobile, it's 1/5 of what it is on a fixed network. so again, we're off of that 10-to-1 ratio. It shows that, communication, social media makes sense is more popular on a mobile device because you're mobile, you're moving around, you're doing kind of shorter bursts of usage.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, it's strange because when I talk to mobile providers, the number one way that they look at quality in their networks is video. What's the resolution? How many buffer stalls? All those things are very, 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 very important to fixed operators, but also to mobile. But social media is a lot more than just heavy video. It's messaging, it's short form video, it's posting stuff, it's upstream. So looking at how do I build a good network for a good mobile network, you need to pay more attention to social media and how social media, or what the social media needs from the network.
And you mentioned upstream traffic as well. I know that a lot of the focus when it comes to planning and so forth is on the downstream traffic, but we did notice that upstream traffic in some ways is becoming more important. Is there a reason for that? Why is that maybe something that they should consider more, the operators, when they are planning out their networks or their capacity?
Yeah, upstream is tricky for mobile networks. Typically, you don't dedicate a whole lot of your frequency span to upstream traffic. It's more often the congestion or choke point than downstream is. And it's also harder to plan for because some of it is just acknowledgement packets for the downstream. That's relatively easy. But then what happens on the upstream is heavy, infrequent things like someone streaming an Instagram live video or a TikTok live video, or even sometimes people taking very large videos, like an hour-long video or whatever, and then as soon as that video finishes, the phone will upload it immediately to iCloud or to Google Drive or something like that for backup. So it's not as predictable as downstream, which makes it hard to plan for. But it often becomes a bottleneck, and when upstream is full, it also affects the quality of experience in whole and on the downstream.
Okay.
We see in fixed networks as well as on mobile networks, things like iCloud and Dropbox being heavy users of upstream, but also communication tools like Zoom or FaceTime, anything that like a video collaboration or video calling is a big consumer of the limited upstream capacity that's there.
Right. Is there anything you want to add, Bill, on that point?
Yeah, I think that, upstream has always been a tricky topic for service providers. And some of the networks, they build the networks with assumptions like upstream will be, 1/5 of downstream or 1/10 of downstream. And whenever you have a subtle shift in those ratios, it can have a really tremendous impact on the planning for those networks. Now, some networks do have symmetrical bandwidth, but most are making these assumptions. So I think the trends on the upstream are really, really interesting. And it's to look at mobile and see that TikTok is the highest upstream consumer by volume. And here you have a relatively new application that is now potentially challenging those ratios and being very disruptive in the market. And it shows that it's not just people scrolling and watching videos, but they're actually on the go uploading videos. And that sort of usage behavior on mobile networks is both fascinating and also something that needs to be accounted for. And the networks need to be planned around it. So I really found the upstream information, the upstream comparisons, to me are almost more interesting than the downstream, right? Because we always look at downstream and we're always analyzing it. But the upstream stuff is you get kind of a clearer picture of popularity and the way the devices themselves are working and what people are really doing, besides being washed out by just constant video usage.
if you think about the peak of peaks, which you really should, like if you there's something called the peak hour. It happens every day. It is when most of us come home, we've had dinner, we sit our ass down in the sofa and we start watching Netflix because so many of us do. It doesn't have to be Netflix, but for 30% of us, Netflix is the go-to app in the sofa. That happens every day. It's a very large percentage of the population in internet connected world on the fixed side, and that's why we get peak hour, couple of hours from maybe 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. That's the traditional kind of peak. That happens every day, but that is not abnormal anymore. That's the normal. So to think of that as the peak is wrong. Video and those apps are what's driving that baseline. And during that peak hour, the OTT streaming video providers are by far the largest contributors to traffic. But then if you ask yourself, is that the peak of peaks? Is that what I need to dimension for? And the answer is no. Because it is what happens on the special days that drive traffic on top of that video peak at peak hour. That is what you need to be worried about and dimension for. And what is in the peak of peaks is almost always a gaming download. When someone releases a new, I don't know, super popular FPS game with Call of Duty, something like that, 100 gigabyte download to release that game, or some sort of in-game download, or a patch or something like that. It happens at a particular time once, everyone goes out and downloads it. That sits on top of those Netflix users. That creates the peak of peaks. And we have a similar situation for upstream. Upstream has a baseline, a norm. It follows the same peak hour, but that doesn't suffer as much from that gaming download. Instead, the peak of peaks for upload are when something happens and everyone starts filming. It could be something that's happening in a city, and everyone is at a concert or at a game. Someone is filming at like 50,000 people are filming at the Super Bowl. That creates a local upstream peak.
Right.
So it's interesting to look at the baseline, but it's also interesting to look at like those 3, 4, 5 times per year when you have a super peak. What is in that?
Right. And we've had that recently, right? We've had over some of our customers' networks with the not only the Super Bowl, but the games leading up to the Super Bowl. We saw some of the highest volumes we've seen. And then I imagine with things like Taylor Swift's Era Tour, I'm imagining that volumes are continuing to increase with each of these events. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this year we had the first ever streaming exclusive wildcard game in the NFL, which we have a lot of interesting stats on, but it was definitely one of those peaks of peaks because it was traffic we hadn't seen before. And the only way you could watch the game was if you had the Peacock service. So we had lots and lots of subscribers signing up for Peacock at the same time and for the first time. And an unusually high percentage of people went to the sofa to watch the game. And some people were standing up, I guess, but most people were sitting. So yeah, that's an extraordinary incident, and I'm thinking that the first time that the Super Bowl streams like that, it's going to be an even bigger event.
Right. And you did touch on the brands a little bit here when you were talking about TikTok. And this year, instead of doing the top 6, we actually looked at the top 8 brands that are generating the most internet traffic, more than everyone else combined. And we came up with the usual suspects of Alphabet and Meta, Netflix, Microsoft, TikTok, and Apple and Amazon. Disney. So this year we have Disney and TikTok showing up, and the total was 65% over fixed, 68% over mobile. So that shows that the pre-pandemic level, so to speak, we didn't go. We're back. The new normal is actually high. It's not. It didn't go dip down after the last 2 years. It's seems to be staying pretty high in terms of the top brands' contribution to daily volume over fixed and mobile is staying pretty steady, and in fact maybe even growing a little bit. Those top 8 brands. Do you think that'll continue?
The data seem to indicate that it is growing. So the concentration is growing, which means that what we do during our days and in the sofa during peak hour seems to be almost normalizing to these few relatively big brands. So the numbers speak for themselves. The concentration of these big brands is growing. They're taking share, which is happening at the same time as we're all annoyed by how many streaming service subscriptions we need to have. I think I'm up to 10 or 12 or something like that. So there's certainly like a lot of breadth to that market as well, but the big guys seem to be getting the vast majority of our time still, and in a growing way. TikTok is just steaming ahead, both on popularity and on traffic volumes. And Disney made our big brand radar for the first time now with 4% of the traffic. Let's see what happens in 6 months or 12 months from now. But I think that the trend is pretty clear that the big guys are growing.
And what about in terms of the big brands for device and cloud gaming? There was a lot of hype about cloud gaming. In the report, we do look at the fact that 14% of households, for example, have an Xbox, each consuming about 4.5 gigabytes per hour. Do you think that cloud gaming, in the next report, maybe will pick up more momentum, or what's kind of, holding it back? Either one of you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I think we do expect cloud gaming to pick up. It's been very slow, right? It's been on the market for years, but what we see mostly is still a dominance in console-based gaming. And the console-based gaming, as Alexander pointed out, can cause a peak of peaks with large file downloads, which literally scare some of my customers on what it does to their networks and the potential service outages it even causes, or preventing good user experience. And I think that those lessons learned from just traditional console gaming have caused people to be very cautious with cloud gaming. And there's been a little bit of rollback and hype. But that same fear from those lessons, I think, is probably really going to hit us more with AR/VR over the next sort of few years as that technology matures. And today, AR/VR, you can see it's still a very small amount of traffic. It's just minuscule, largely because they're behaving almost like consoles, where most of the processing's happening on board and locally, and there's not a high amount of network bandwidth required. But expect that to change in the years to come as these AR/VR devices become more mainstream, become more mobile, and use more and more bandwidth. And just like cloud gaming, that has it does scare our customers, and they are worried about that. But they've have so many lessons learned. I think that they're planning appropriately for it, and it's kind of the next horizon, and changing user behavior, driving changes in network bandwidth.
Right. And we do touch on that in the report. We have a section where we talk about internet technology adoption curve, and we look at the innovators through the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and then the laggards. So that's another interesting part of the report, where we look at where different categories of applications fall on that curve. And that touches on what you're talking about, where cloud gaming is still in the kind of the beginning cycle, where it's the innovative users that would be the first to do that. So we'll see how that curve changes over time.
Yeah, it's really two things. It is how many people adopt something like cloud gaming, and we see I think GeForce Now, which is NVIDIA, released that they have 30 million subscribers. Xbox and Microsoft has less, 10 or 15 or something like that. So it's still significant numbers, and we see 1-2% of the subscriber base use cloud gaming on a daily, in every day, or in a given day. So still small numbers, but not insignificant. But then you look at how much volume they drive, and it's still very small. Like the average GeForce Now session or volume in a day per user is 1 gigabyte, which is just a couple of minutes of gameplay. So relatively small, but still significant numbers of users, but very short game sessions. There's just so much demand that's going to come from those gamers in the future if that technology comes. I mean, an hour of gameplay would be a staggering amount of volume, way more than a 1 gigabyte that we're recording today.
Right. And Bill,
So it is. I think it's the biggest thing that's going to hit networks if it does take off. Nothing's going to change traffic volumes the way that cloud gaming will, but it's not going to take off until the networks are like super solid. Gamers are very picky.
right.
The slightest packet loss or stall in their gaming session, they're going to shut it off and they're going to go over to their PlayStation and continue playing.
And Bill was talking about how this type of thing, can scare some of the operators out there. So does that tie to why it's important to have this type of visualization and visibility in terms of the potential of new business models in the future, or having, electronic detail records that would prove what the usage is as these types of things take off? I mean, is that the you've mentioned that this report is more usable than past ones. So does this help operators get ready for that day when it comes, and being able to perhaps do some sort of network arbitrage, or, in certain regions where that might be possible, and new business models, and
I think
preparing?
this report more than ever shows it's not just that the operators want to do something about it, but the originators of that content, of those downloads, those OTT providers, they also want to be involved in making sure that users get a good experience, and that it's equally important that both sides are working together. That we have to share these networks across real-time communication as well as heavy downloads and heavy video streaming. And if one breaks another, it's not good for anybody. I believe that this report just shows the ever-evolving dynamics and ratios in the content, and that the traffic is video still growing at crazy speeds, yet the percentage of users using these apps is still relatively modest. So there's a lot more room to grow. And as Alexander said, cloud gaming is, very small percentage of users using the apps, but huge potential volume. And so you get all these different dynamics that are happening. And I love the way the report lays out that, the dominant are becoming more dominant almost, but there's a lot of other stuff going on, and we're still very early on in the transition to online video streaming and online gaming and online, real-time communication. There's a ton more growth to come, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I personally don't believe that the current business models are really sustainable for our industry. And I'll try to explain why. The OTTs that we're talking about, let's say GeForce Now, Xbox Cloud Gaming, Netflix, video gaming, doesn't matter, Zoom, all these apps, everyone benefits from better networks. Right now, the networks are holding back cloud gaming. Netflix are not really holding back streaming video providers, but we still see that streaming video providers make more money in good networks, because if Netflix doesn't work well, I don't sign up or I don't renew my subscription. So it is, the OTTs are dependent on the telcos to build good networks, but they're not contributing to the funds that build these networks. And I think that just won't be sustainable in the future and isn't sustainable now. The OTTs can raise their prices. How much do we pay the OTTs in a month compared to how much we pay our telcos? And that ratio is getting out of whack. I think it's time for the service provider, the OTT service providers, and especially the large traffic generators that generate massive volumes, to pay their share. And we'll, as an industry, we'll figure out a fair way to do that. And I think everyone will benefit. Netflix will benefit because their services will work better and they can stream at higher resolutions with fewer buffer stalls, and everyone's going to be happy. Cloud gamers are going to be happy. Like, I think everyone will benefit if we can tune the business model a little bit to a more fair landscape.
Right. Even Mark Zuckerberg at Mobile World Congress, it was either I think it was last year, said that, massive connectivity is needed for AR, VR to take off for the metaverse. So it's a symbiotic relationship is definitely seems to be necessary.
Yeah, he'll need it.
So I think, this is a good point to wrap this up by saying, the report definitely shows the type of tabular analysis we can give individual operators and service providers. We can help both sides, the OTTs as well as the operators, to see what's really happening, and that this report is just the beginning in terms of how we will be able to more frequently, more cyclically keep up with current trends and see what's going on, maybe one quarter to the next, because of the type of granularity we now have and then the new visualizations that we have. So I really appreciate, Bill and Alexander, that you came by today to explain some of this. So thank you very much for joining today.